Imagine living all by yourself in a small, quiet rental house just on the outskirts of a sleepy town. That was my life a few years ago. It was a simple one-story house situated right at the end of a very short dead-end road. On this entire street, there were only 5 houses, and when night fell, the whole neighborhood would become incredibly quiet. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant my daily routine was pretty isolated. Most days, I did not have any reason to leave the house at all, unless I absolutely had to run out to get some groceries. I rarely ever got visitors, and even when my friends wanted to hang out, they would always send me a text message before coming over. Because of this quiet lifestyle, the very first knock on my door stood out in a way that I will never forget. It was a Thursday evening, around 8:45, and the night was as still as could be. I was sitting comfortably in my living room, watching some television, when suddenly I heard 4 very firm, deliberate knocks on my front door. I immediately muted the TV and sat there completely still, waiting and listening. I thought to myself that maybe I had just imagined it, or perhaps it was a random noise from outside. But then there were 2 more sharp knocks. I got up from the couch and slowly walked over to the front door. There was a small peephole right in the center of the wood, and when I leaned in to look through it, I saw a man standing out on my porch. He was holding a medium-sized cardboard box in his hands. He was wearing a dark jacket and a standard baseball cap, and he looked completely ordinary, probably somewhere in his mid-30s. I decided to open the door, but I made sure to keep the heavy safety chain securely locked in place. As soon as the door cracked open, the man looked at me and said that he had a delivery that required a signature. He looked down and read a name off a small handheld device he was holding, but the problem was, the name he read was not my name. In fact, it was not even close to my name. I calmly told him that he must have the wrong address, and that no one by that name lived there. The man looked down at the box, then back at his device, and then he looked right back at me. He proceeded to read the address out loud, and it was my exact address, down to the very last digit. I shook my head and repeated that no one by that name had ever lived here. He stared at me through the gap in the door for a second longer than was comfortable. It was this blank, lingering stare that made my stomach drop slightly. Then, he finally said that he must have been given the wrong information by his company, and that he would take the package back to his truck. I stood there and watched him walk back down my driveway. I fully expected to see a delivery van, or at least a regular car parked somewhere along the street, but there was absolutely nothing. He just walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the dead-end road, disappearing into the night. I quickly shut the door, locked it, and tried to convince myself that it was just a driver working for a local delivery contractor who had parked around the block. But the next night, at almost the exact same time, the peace of my evening was shattered again. There were 3 knocks on the door. This time I did not even think about opening it. I walked straight to the peephole and looked through. It was the exact same man, wearing the same dark jacket, holding the same cardboard box. I kept the door shut and spoke loudly through the wood, telling him that he had already come by the night before, and that no one with that name lived at this house. The man did not answer right away. There was a long, tense pause. Then he spoke in a flat voice, saying he just needed a signature, and that his system showed the package absolutely had to be delivered tonight. I raised my voice slightly and told him that I was absolutely not signing for a package for someone I did not know. Another long pause followed. He finally said okay and stepped back from the door, but instead of walking away, he stood right at the edge of my porch, looking at the house. He slowly turned his head to look at my front windows, then toward the side of the house, and then right back at the door. He stood there, scanning my home for about 15 seconds, before he finally turned and walked down the driveway. Once again, there was no vehicle. That was the moment where everything started to feel completely wrong. On the 3rd night, there was no knock at all. I actually felt a massive wave of relief wash over me, thinking that he had finally realized his mistake. I even joked to myself about how weird it would have been if he had actually shown up a 3rd time. But my relief was incredibly short-lived. On the 4th night, I was standing in the kitchen washing dishes around 9 o'clock in the evening. Suddenly, I heard 4 knocks. But the problem was, they did not come from the front door. They came from the side of the house, right against my dining room window. I froze, slowly walked into the dining room and peered toward the glass, but the darkness outside was complete, and I could not see anyone. Then, just seconds later, there were 4 more heavy knocks, this time back at the front door. I hurried to the peephole and looked through. It was him again, but this time something was different. His hands were completely empty. He was not holding any box. I kept entirely silent, holding my breath. He knocked again, and then he stepped back and looked directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was standing right there looking at him. I stepped away from the door so he could not detect any movement, and I stayed completely still. After about 30 seconds, he turned and walked down the steps. I waited for 5 full minutes before I dared to check the windows. I turned off every single light in the house and walked from room to room, gently parting the blinds to look outside, and that is when I saw him. He was standing directly across the street, right near the dark tree line. He was just standing there, completely still, facing my house. He watched my home for about a minute before he finally turned and walked off into the darkness of the woods. My hands were shaking as I went around the house, checking and relocking every single window and door, even though they were already locked tight. The very next morning, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained the entire situation to them. The officer I spoke to listened quietly, and then told me that it sounded like someone was trying to verify occupancy. He explained that burglars often use this tactic, knocking on doors to see if anyone answers before they attempt a break-in. He advised me to install security cameras as soon as possible, and told me to call 911 immediately if the man ever came back. That night, I decided to leave all the front lights of the house completely off to make it look like no one was home, and I stayed in my back bedroom. At exactly 8:45, right on schedule, there were 4 loud knocks at the front door. I did not respond. I sat on my bed in the pitch black, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few seconds, there were 4 more knocks, followed by complete silence. I waited for about a minute, thinking he might have left, but then I heard a soft, heavy thud against the back of my house, followed by another. I realized with sheer terror that someone was testing the back door. I grabbed my phone, slipped out of my bedroom, and crept into the hallway. In the silence, I could hear the back doorknob turning slowly. It would turn, stop, and then turn again. I immediately dialed 911 and whispered to the dispatcher that someone was actively trying to break into my house. While I was whispering to the dispatcher, the loud knocking started up again at the front door. The dispatcher told me that officers were already on their way, but the terror was overwhelming. The back doorknob kept turning, and I could hear faint murmurs, indicating there was more than one person out there. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping lightly against the back door frame. They were trying to pry it open. After about 30 terrifying seconds, everything suddenly went silent. I stayed on the line, frozen in the hallway, until the police arrived with their sirens flashing. When the officers searched the exterior of my house, they found fresh pry marks on the wooden frame of my back door, right near the handle. The officer looked at me and said that if I had not been home to call them, the door likely would have been forced wide open. They searched the surrounding streets, but could not find anyone suspicious. The next night, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I packed a small bag and went to stay at my brother's apartment across town. I did not tell anyone on social media that I was leaving my house empty. Around 9 o'clock that evening, my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor, who lived 2 houses down. She asked me if I was home because she could see a man standing on my front porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been standing there for at least 5 minutes. I told her I was not home and asked if he had a car. She said she did not see any vehicle nearby. I told her to hang up and call the police immediately. The police arrived quickly this time and caught the man right on my porch. They questioned him, and later that night, an officer called me with an update. The man had claimed to the officers that he was just a delivery driver who had misplaced his package. But he had absolutely no company identification, no uniform, and no delivery vehicle. The police gave him a strict warning to stay away from my property and let him go. But fast forward 2 days later, and the police arrested the exact same man in a nearby neighborhood. He had been caught red-handed, attempting to break into a house where the owners were out of town. When they searched his personal car, they found several empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that was completely fake and not connected to any delivery company. During his interrogation, he finally confessed to his entire operation. He admitted to detectives that he would always knock on doors with a fake package first. If someone answered, he would simply make up a name, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if no one answered after multiple attempts over several nights, he would return later with tools to force entry. He even told the detectives that he would intentionally knock several nights in a row to see if the pattern of the house changed. If he saw lights on one night and completely dark the next, he would assume the occupants had left and that the house was ripe for a burglary. Hearing his confession made my blood run cold. I realized just how incredibly close I had come to being a victim. If I had decided to ignore the door on those very first nights, he would have assumed the house was empty and broken in while I was asleep. I was so shaken by the entire ordeal that I moved out of that rental house just 3 months later when my lease finally ended. To this very day, I never answer my door at night unless I know exactly who is coming over. If someone knocks unexpectedly, I stay completely quiet, keep the lights low, and check my security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up at my door with a package that has my address but not my name, I do not even go near the door. Now our second story takes us across the ocean to the cold winter landscape of Scotland, just outside the city of Glasgow. This was back in the days leading up to Christmas, and the entire area was covered in a beautiful thick blanket of snow. I was 16 years old at the time, living in a lovely house with my parents, my siblings, and our family cats and dogs. We were an incredibly close-knit family, and we loved spending our winter evenings together in the cozy living room, watching movies, playing board games, and just catching up on each other's days. During one of those late nights, right before Christmas, we were all gathered around the television, watching A Christmas Carol. It was a family tradition, and the atmosphere was wonderful. But right in the middle of the movie, we heard a sudden knock at the front door. Since it was the holiday season, we figured it was just a neighbor or a delivery, so my mom got up to answer it. But when she opened the door, the front porch was completely empty. There was nobody there. Our garden wrapped around from the front of the house to the backyard, so she walked out and checked the sides, but the street was dead silent and completely vacant. She came back inside, slightly confused, and we went back to watching our movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the dining room table, focusing on some high school exam prep work. Out of nowhere, another sharp knock sounded at the door. I put my pen down, walked over and opened it, but once again, there was absolutely nobody there. We all assumed that it was just some of the local neighborhood kids playing a prank. In Scotland, there is a very famous street game that kids play called Chappie. The rules are simple. You run up to someone's door, knock as loud as you can, and then run away laughing to hide in the bushes. It is a silly, childish game, but the quick rush of adrenaline can be fun for kids who are bored during the winter holidays. We had a family group chat where we kept in touch, and over the course of that week, almost everyone in the family messaged the group saying they had experienced the same random knocking, but the incident that stood out the most happened to my dad. My dad was a night owl, and he would usually stay up much later than the rest of the house, playing video games or watching shows once everything had gone quiet. One night, around 11:30, when the entire street was pitch black and silent, he heard an incredibly quiet, gentle knock on the front door. He was deeply confused because of how late it was. He crept over to the door and looked through the peephole, but he saw nothing but the empty snow-covered street. He slowly unlocked the door and stepped outside to look around, but there was no one. He locked up and came upstairs to ask if any of us had heard it, but we had all been fast asleep. This was the moment where the situation started to feel genuinely unsettling. Usually, when kids play Chappie, you can hear them whispering, giggling, or the sound of their footsteps running away on the pavement. But this was different. It was completely silent, and yet the knocks kept happening. Everything escalated to a terrifying degree on Christmas night. We had spent the entire day opening presents, sharing food, playing games, and having an amazing holiday. By the end of the night, I had eaten way too much food and started to feel incredibly sick. I decided to head upstairs early to lie down in my bed, and I ended up drifting off to sleep. I woke up hours later, feeling completely awake. I checked my phone, and the glowing screen read 2 o'clock in the morning. The entire house was dead silent, and everyone else was asleep. I knew I would not be able to fall back asleep anytime soon, so I just stayed in bed, scrolling through social media in the dark, watching videos and texting a few friends who were also awake, and then I heard a very faint knock. I froze in my bed. I could not tell if the sound had come from my bedroom door, my window, or if I was just imagining things because of the creepy events of the past few weeks. My heart started racing as I stared into the pitch-black room. I knew for a fact that absolutely no one should be outside my house at 2 in the morning on Christmas night. Since my bedroom was on the second floor of the house, the idea of someone knocking on my window was terrifying and highly unlikely unless they had a ladder. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to get out of bed and slowly opened my bedroom door to look out into the hallway. But as soon as the door cracked open, I heard the heavy, slow sound of footsteps coming up our wooden stairs. My brain immediately tried to rationalize the sound, thinking that it must be my dad coming up to bed after staying up late. I stepped out into the hallway, preparing to whisper to him that I was still awake. But as I looked down the staircase, the breath caught in my throat. It was not my dad. Standing on the stairs was a man I had never seen before in my life. He was staggering heavily as he climbed, looking completely intoxicated. I felt a wave of pure sickness wash over me. I realized that this man was already inside our locked house. I backed up as quietly as I could into my bedroom, closing the door softly before he could look up and see me. I stood behind my door, trembling, as I listened to him wander around the second floor. I could hear him opening doors, walking into each room one by one. I knew it was only a matter of seconds before he reached my bedroom door. My mind went completely blank, and all of my common sense seemed to vanish in the face of sheer panic. After a moment, I carefully cracked my door open just a tiny bit to see where he was. I saw him stumbling out of my younger sister's bedroom. The sight of him near my sister's room shocked my brain back into action. I ran as fast and as quietly as I could to my parents' bedroom, throwing the door open and shaking them awake. I whispered frantically that there was a stranger inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, but my dad was still groggy and confused. We all crept downstairs together, and when we reached the living room, we saw the man. He was completely passed out, sprawling across our family couch. Around him on the floor were several of my dad's beers, which he had taken from the fridge, opened and spilled everywhere. My mom immediately began shouting at him to get out of our house. The man stirred, opened his eyes, and angrily started shouting back at us, claiming that the house belonged to him, and that we were the ones who needed to leave. We tried to pull him up, but his body was completely dead weight, and he refused to move. My mom, in a panic, slapped him across the face to try and wake him up, but he barely even registered the hit. At this point, my dad was fully awake and realized the danger we were in. He stepped forward, grabbed the man by his clothes, and physically lifted him off the couch. He dragged him across the room, opened the side door, and threw him out into the cold night, warning him in a loud, booming voice never to step foot on our property again. We thought the nightmare was finally over, but just seconds after my dad slammed the door shut, there was a massive, deafening crash. The man had swung his fist and punched directly through the glass window next to the door. Shards of sharp glass showered into the hallway. Through the broken frame, the man thrust his bleeding face, staring at us with wild, angry eyes, looking like a terrifying scene straight out of a horror movie. He began screaming violent threats at us, yelling that he now owned the house, that he knew exactly what our faces looked like, and that he would come back to get us. While he was screaming, my dad ran to the phone to call the police. Hearing that we were calling the authorities, the man finally pulled his face out of the broken window and stumbled away into the dark. The police arrived a short time later and took detailed statements from all of us. Because of the freezing winter weather, a fresh layer of snow had fallen that night. When the officers walked outside, they immediately noticed a very clear, bright red trail of blood leading away from our broken window and down the street. The officers followed the blood trail through the snow, which led them straight to a nearby community playground. There, lying on the ground in the snow, was the intruder, clutching his heavily bleeding hands, which were filled with embedded shards of glass. They arrested him on the spot. It turns out that the man had actually lived in our house many years ago, before my family had ever purchased it. On Christmas night, he had gone out drinking with his friends, became extremely intoxicated, and in his drunken confusion, he had walked to his old address, found a way inside, and honestly believed he was in his own home. He was fined for the property damage and sentenced to community service. But despite his explanation, he denied having anything to do with the mysterious knocking that had plagued our family for weeks leading up to that night. To this day, we still do not know if the knocks were just a coincidence, or if someone else was watching our house from the shadows. Our third story takes us back to the year 2010, in the quiet city of Springfield, Oregon. At the time, I was just a little girl, only 6 years old. I lived in a cozy suburban neighborhood with my mother, my older brother, and my sister. My dad was a dedicated member of the military, and he was deployed overseas when this happened. I was incredibly close with my father, and whenever he was away on deployment, I struggled a lot with feelings of anxiety and sadness. I missed him terribly, and the house always felt a little less safe without him there to protect us. One late night, it was pouring rain outside. The rain in Oregon can be incredibly heavy and cold, but my mom and I decided to sit out on our covered front porch together anyway. She was having a cigarette, and I was just enjoying being close to her, listening to the soothing sound of the rain hitting the pavement. As we sat there in the dark, we noticed a figure walking right down the middle of our street. The man was wearing a very bright, oversized yellow rain jacket. In the dim glow of the streetlights, the bright yellow color stood out instantly. It was incredibly late, and the street was completely empty, so seeing someone walking on foot in the middle of a torrential downpour immediately put my mom on high alert. We sat perfectly still, watching him as he walked, but then he adjusted his path and began walking directly toward our driveway. My mom did not hesitate. She stood up, threw her cigarette into the rain, grabbed my hand tightly, and started to lead me back toward the front door. But as we turned to go inside, the man in the yellow jacket stopped right next to our garbage cans at the edge of the driveway. He looked directly at us and began screaming at the top of his lungs. I was too young and terrified to understand the words he was shouting, but the sheer anger in his voice sent a wave of pure panic through my body. My mom rushed me inside the house, quickly locked the heavy wooden door, and went around turning off every single light in the home. I was crying hysterically, completely terrified by the screaming man. My mom gathered my brother, my sister, and me, shushing us gently, and we all piled into her large king-sized bed. We huddled together in the dark, waiting to see if the man would leave. After a while, the shouting stopped, and silence returned to the neighborhood. Exhausted from the fear, we eventually fell asleep, but that night I had one of the worst nightmares of my life. I dreamed of a man in a massive yellow rain jacket, standing right outside our window, peering in at us through the glass with a terrifying smile. I woke up from the nightmare sobbing and shaking with fear. I reached over and shook my sister awake, begging her to comfort me because I was too scared to move. My sister, seeing how upset I was, got out of bed and walked me to the bathroom that was attached to the master bedroom. She closed the door and sat with me in the soft light, talking to me in a quiet voice to help calm me down without waking our mom or brother. But while we were sitting on the bathroom floor, a massive, deafening noise shattered the quiet of the night. Someone was violently slamming their fists against our front door. It was a loud, aggressive pounding that shook the entire house. My sister bolted out of the bathroom and ran to shake our mother awake. My brother woke up instantly from the noise. I sat frozen on the bathroom floor as my mom frantically searched the room for her old BlackBerry phone. But the problem was, she could not find it anywhere in the dark. That meant we had absolutely no way to call for help. We did not have a landline, and my mom's phone was the only lifeline we possessed. We were completely trapped in the house with an aggressive stranger outside, and my dad, our protector, was thousands of miles away. We all huddled together on the bathroom floor, crying and holding on to each other in absolute silence. Outside, the man was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that we open the door and let him inside, all while continuing to throw his body in fists against the wood. It was a completely hopeless feeling. We prayed that one of our close neighbors in the duplex next door would hear the chaos and call the police, but no sirens ever came. After what felt like hours of terror, the screaming and banging finally stopped, and the man walked away into the rain. Life returned to normal for a couple of weeks, and we slowly began to let our guard down. But then, the nightmare returned in a different way. One morning, our family woke up and walked into the living room, only to find our front door standing wide open to the street. My mom gasped and ran around the house. She discovered that one of our side windows was wide open, and a giant hole had been neatly cut into the window screen from the outside. Someone had broken into our home while we were all asleep. My mom located her phone and immediately called the police. As we looked around, we realized that several random items were missing from the house. But the absolute most disturbing discovery was what had been taken from the bedroom. My small piggy bank, which contained all of my holiday savings, was gone. And even worse, a large glass vase that was filled to the brim with cash and coins we had been saving for months was completely missing. That glass vase had been sitting directly on my nightstand, right next to the bed where my entire family had been sleeping. The realization that an intruder had crept into our dark bedroom, stood right over our sleeping bodies, and stolen items off my nightstand made me physically sick. The police investigated the break-in, but the intruder was never caught. A few months later, while walking around our neighborhood, I happened to look at the porch of a nearby house. Sitting right there on the table of a neighbor who lived completely alone was a giant glass vase that looked identical to the one that had been stolen from my nightstand. We never had proof, and the police could not do anything without evidence. But to this day, I cannot help but wonder if that quiet neighbor was the man in the yellow rain jacket who had terrorized us. Our fourth and final story takes us to the state of Idaho, around the same time. I was serving a full-time mission for my church, and my companion, whom I will call Spencer, and I were assigned to a very small, remote rural town. Because the town was so tiny, there was rarely much for us to do during the day. At the time, I was also going through a really difficult phase in my life, struggling with severe self-esteem issues and terrible insomnia that kept me awake for most of the night. Unlike most missionaries who are assigned to apartment complexes, Spencer and I were living in a small independent house. It was a tiny one-story property that sat on its own lot, right next door to our landlord's house. The layout of our home was very basic. When you walked through the front door, you immediately entered a main living area where our study desks were set up. To your right was our shared bedroom. If you walked straight through the living area, you went through a large, open archway that led directly into the kitchen. Off the kitchen, there was a small bathroom on the right and a laundry room on the left. One cold evening, after it had been dark for several hours, Spencer and I were relaxing inside. Spencer was sitting on his bed in the bedroom, looking at his phone, while I was sitting at my desk in the living room. My chair was angled so that I was facing the open kitchen. Suddenly, a sharp single knock sounded through the house. It came from the kitchen window, right above the sink. Because of the open layout of the house, anyone standing outside that kitchen window had a direct line of sight to exactly where I was sitting in the living room. I stopped what I was doing and stared at the dark kitchen window for a few seconds, but the glass was completely black, and I could not see anything outside. I tried to convince myself that it was just a loose tree branch brushing against the side of the house. There were several large trees behind the property, but as I thought about it more, I realized that none of the branches were long enough to reach the window, and a branch would never make such a sharp, solid knocking sound. Just as I was having this thought, another loud knock sounded, but this time it came from the window in the laundry room, around the corner from the kitchen. The terrifying reality of the situation finally hit me. Someone was actively walking around our tiny house in the dark, knocking on our windows. I stood up from my desk and started to call out to Spencer to tell him what was happening. But before the words could leave my mouth, a third, heavy knock sounded right next to my head, on the living room window. I did not look out to see who was there. I turned and bolted into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I asked Spencer if he had heard the noises, and his wide eyes told me everything. He had heard them too. We sat on the bed, whispering and trying to figure out what to do. Our only defense was a couple of small kitchen knives, and we had no idea how many people were outside, or if they had weapons. We debated calling the emergency services, but we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that we knew it would take the police a very long time to reach our location. Suddenly, the knocking sound moved. It left the side windows and started pounding directly on our heavy wooden front door. We were both terrified. Spencer suddenly remembered that we had our landlord's phone number saved. He quickly dialed the number and began explaining the situation to him in a panicked whisper. By this point, the knocking on the front door had stopped, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the house. But I knew the layout of the property, and I knew what was coming next. My stomach twisted in dread. And then it happened. A sharp, clear knock sounded right against our bedroom window, just inches from where we were sitting. The window blinds were pulled completely shut, so the person outside could not see us, and we could not see them. But knowing that only a thin pane of glass separated us from a stalker in the dark made my heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. On the phone, our landlord told Spencer to stay put and said he was walking over right now with his loaded shotgun. We sat in the dark bedroom, holding our breath, waiting for the next knock. But the house remained completely silent. After a few minutes, we heard a heavy knock on the front door, followed by our landlord's voice announcing himself. We ran to open the door and let him inside. We asked him if he had seen the person responsible, but he shook his head. He told us that as he was walking over to our house, he saw a dark pickup truck suddenly speed away down the dirt road with its headlights off. He had been too far away to get a license plate or see the driver. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights, and along with our landlord and his shotgun, we went outside to investigate. A few days prior, a light snow had fallen, leaving thin patches of white on the ground around the house. In the snow, our flashlights illuminated a clear, single set of footprints. The footprints went in a complete circle around our entire house, stopping directly beneath every single window. We talked about calling the police, but with the truck long gone and no physical description of the stalker, we knew there was very little they could do. Our landlord told us to call us immediately if we heard anything else, and then he went back to his house next door. Spencer and I locked every lock on the doors and windows, but neither of us could sleep a wink that night. We tried to think of logical explanations. We wondered if it was a prank by some of the other young missionaries in our area. But it was way past curfew. Everyone was required to be in their own homes, and the nearest missionaries lived over 20 minutes away. We also thought about the local teenagers, but usually, when teenagers play a prank, they want to see your reaction and laugh about it afterward. This person had stayed completely silent, lurking in the dark. In the weeks that followed, no one ever confessed to the knocking, and the identity of the person in the dark pickup truck remained a mystery. But the absolute scariest part of the entire experience for me was not the footprints or the knocking itself. It was the realization that when that very first knock happened on the kitchen window above the sink, I had looked directly at the glass. Because of the lights inside and the darkness outside, I could not see him, but he had been standing right there, looking directly through the glass at me, watching my every move. My sleep issues only grew worse after that night, and the memory of those dark windows still haunts me to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.